Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, how are you doing? I hope everything runs well. We are from group 7 and today we are going to discuss about instructional strategies. But first of all, let us introduce ourselves. My name is NURUL and my partner is NOVITA ANGGREINI. And the Honorable, our lecturer of instructional design, Miss Ria Yunita MPD. Okay, I will explain the first material. It is about an overview of instructional strategy. According to Regulus 1983, instructional strategies are composed of three different aspects or components of instructional strategies. They are organizational strategies. Organizational strategies refers to organizational strategies characteristics refer to how instruction will be sequenced, what particular content will be presented, and how this content will be presented. In this term, there are two parts. They are macro strategies with scope and sequence structures, and micro strategies with expanded instructional events. And then the second one is delivery strategies. Delivery strategies characteristics deal with what instructional medium will be used and how learners will be grouped. It refers to media selection and grouping strategies. And then the third one is management strategies. In management strategies characteristics include the scheduling and allocation of resources to implement the instruction that is organized and delivered as planned within the previous two strategy aspects. It includes the scheduling and acquisition of resources. Okay, now let's move on to the lesson level organizational strategies. In the organizational strategy, the designer selects should facilitate these operations. Instructional and cognitive psychologists have researched extensively what the characteristics of organizational instructional strategies should be. These characteristics may vary according to the type of goal. For example, in declarative knowledge, concepts, and so on. However, there are some general characteristics of an organizational strategy that seem to facilitate learning. Whatever the objective, one of these characteristics is that organization of a lesson should generally follow this pattern. Okay, which are the expanded events of instruction. They are introduction, body, conclusion, and assessment. In this part, I will explain the two of these, which is introduction and body. Well, let me start from the introduction. In introduction, there are four parts of instruction. First is activate attention or gain attention. The purpose of this event is for learners to focus their attention on the learning task. And then the second one is establish purpose or inform learner to instructional purpose. In this part, learners can establish their own purposes in learning. And then the third one is arouse interest and motivation or stimulate learners' attention. In this part, learners are informed of the importance and relevance of the lesson and are encouraged to explore the personal relevance of the lesson. And then the last part is preview the lesson or provide overview. The instruction itself may summarize the procedure or process that will be followed in the lesson, or the learners may choose or be encouraged to preview the lesson using whatever strategies they already possess. Now, let's move on to the body. In this part, there are 6 steps or 6 events. First one is recall prior knowledge. What does it mean? In this part, means that learners are stimulated to retrieve knowledge from long-term memory that is necessary or helpful in learning the new objective. It may also be intermixed with the next event, processing information and examples. The next is process information. And examples, learners encounter the material they will be learning. And then the third is focus attention or gain and direct attention. Means that the learner's attention must be refocused continuously throughout the lesson, although it was invoked at the beginning of interaction. And then the fourth is employ learning strategies. Means that the purpose of this event is to assist learners to use effective strategies, and that purpose is essentially accomplished by prompting learners to use appropriate learning strategies. The fifth is practice or elicit response. Means that learners can be given the opportunity, or they may take the opportunity to interact with the material being learned and see if they are ready to proceed the next part of the lesson. And then the last one is evaluate feedback or provide feedback. In this event means a critical event in instruction, and it is one that is too often slighted or overlooked. The purpose is to give learners the opportunity to consider information about the about the appropriateness of their responses during practice. Well, that's all from me. The next material will be explained by NOVITA ANGGREINI. Novi, time is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is NOVITA ANGGREINI. So I'm going to continue the next explanation. It's about conclusion. A conclusion allows learners to review and elaborate recent learning so that it can be available for further application and use. Conclusion can be delivered through these ways. The first is summarize and review, or provide summary and reviews. It's to ensure that the learners recall and synthesize the critical parts of the lesson into a memorable and applicable whole. And then the second is about transfer learning. Transfer of learning can be described in terms of a continuum from what is termed mere transfer to what is learned for transfer. The third is about remotivate and close. So learners' attitudes toward learning and new content will greatly influence how well the learning will be acquired initially, and how well that learning will be retained. And then the next slide is about assessment. There are two kinds of assessment. The first is assess learning or conduct assessment. Conduct assessment to assess whether learners have achieved the goals of the instruction. Assessment information is critical to the designer, instructor, and the learners. Designers use the information to continuously revise instruction. The assessed the assessed learning event may not occur during the lesson itself. The second is evaluate feedback and seek remediation, or provide feedback and remediation. The feedback learners receive after assessment is often more cumulative, such as percent correct or number of objective mastered, than the feedback accompanying practice. This evaluation usually leads to a conclusion on the learner's and often instructor's part, such as grade or an overall judgment of the learner's mastery of the content. The designer may plan for remediation activities for learners, such as additional practice sets or another presentations of the body of the instruction in an alternative forms. Okay, the next slide is about events of instructions. According to ANGGREINI 1972, he has suggested that lessons include 9 events of instructions. The first is gaining attention. The second is informing the learner of the objective. The third is stimulating recall of prerequisite learning. The fourth is presenting stimulus materials. The fifth is providing learning guidance. The sixth is eliciting performance. The seventh is providing feedback. The eighth is assessing performance. And the last is enhancing retention and transfer. So the next slide is about supplantive versus generative strategies of instruction. According to Solomon 1979, supplantive strategies explicitly providing a preview of the lesson and so on. Supplantive instruction tends to conserve novice learners' cognitive capacity for acquiring skills and knowledge related to the learning task by limiting the amount of responsibility they must carry for structuring the learning situation. And for the generative strategies, according to Will Rock 1974, generative strategies are those approaches in which learners encounter in content in such a way that they are encouraged or allowed to construct their own idiosyncratic meanings from the instruction by generating their own educational goals, organization, elaboration, sequencing and emphasis of content, monitoring of understanding, and transfer to other contexts. In other words, learners generate the preponderance of information processing during learning by providing much of the events of instruction themselves. Next slide is about the balance of generative and supplantive strategies. This is choice of generative supplantive instructional strategies model. For the generative strategies model is more generative, which is low level of scaffolding, and then for the supplantive strategies model is more supplantive, which is high level of scaffolding. So it is important to note that instruction on both ends of the supplantive generative continuum as well as those combination in between can first lead to personal interpretations of knowledge. The second is involve high levels of activity on the learner's part. The third is be interesting, relevant, and motivating. The next slide is about 4 principles for determining optimal degree of instructional support. It depends upon factors within the learners. The first principles is about learners' characteristic. Learners' characteristic, the most critical factors influencing the effective balance between generative and supplantive approaches. The first is if all is being equal, if the higher the level of prior knowledge, the more generative the instructional strategy can be. And then all is being equal, instruction for learners who have a large and sophisticated repertoire of cognitive strategies can be more generative. And then instruction for learners with generally high aptitude can be more generative. And then instruction for learners who have a high level of motivation and interest can be more generative. And then instruction for learners who have high levels of anxiety should have supplantive strategies available. And then the last is instruction for learners who tend to attribute learning success or failure to factors external to themselves should begin at a more supplantive point on the continuum and gradually move to a more generative level. The second principles is about context characteristic. Context characteristic is significantly influenced where a lesson falls on the generative supplantive continuum. All is being equal when instructional time is limited. The instructional strategy should be more supplantive. And then when goals for learning to learn are given higher priority than goals for domain specific skills, a more generative strategy should be emphasized. And then when high achievement of domain specific goals is a higher priority than learning to learn skill, then a more supplantive strategy should be emphasized. And then when achievement of domain specific goals is universal for all learners are expected to learn to at least minimum level of competence, then a more supplantive strategy should be available. And then the last is when the educational strategy has high accountability, then more supplantive strategies should be available. The third principle is learning task. Learning task is the nature of learning task should also influence the effective balance between generative and supplantive strategies. The first is all is being equal. The higher in the intellectual skills or closer to domain specific problem solving, the more generative the strategy. And then the more complex the problem, the more supplantive the start point of the instruction, and the more critical progression toward more likely generative instruction. And then in situation in which learner misconceptions during the learning process could translate into physical or emotional hazards for themselves or others. A more supplantive strategy should be employed. And then learning goals that are associated with critically high levels of competence and consistency should utilize somewhat more supplantive strategies. The last principle is overall principles. Overall principles, two overarching principles can guide designers in determining the optimal level of instructional support. So, an optimal instruction strategy goes as far toward the generative goal as possible, while still providing sufficient support for learners to achieve learning in the time possible with a limited and acceptable amount of frustration, anxiety, and danger. During instruction in a particular knowledge area or learning task, the instruction should progressively move toward the generative goal as learners gain skill, knowledge, motivation, and confidence.
Well, guys, that's all from us. Here is the reference of our presentation today. And do you have any questions? You may ask on our next session forum. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.